Hey guys, today I'm going to go over the basic settings for DSLR video and how I can make your videos a lot better. The first thing we're going to talk about is frame rate. If you want your videos to be more cinematic, the more universal frame rate that people use, I would go with 24. If you want more of a vlog video style, I would go with 30 frames per second. That's a little bit more crisper with the movements. TV also shoots in 30 frames per second. If you want to do slow-mo, you shoot at 60 frames. Slow it down to half speed, which is basically double of 24. You want to shoot in a higher frame rate so that when you slow it down, it looks like the 24 frames. Some cameras come with 120 frames per second, super slow-mo. That's like those commercials you watch with like the fruit all falling onto each other. The moisture droplets are flying off and everything looks so beautiful. The next thing that you're gonna wanna move to is shutter speed. Shutter speed is exactly how fast each frame is being captured in the form of fractions of a second. Always have your shutter speed, the bottom number in that ratio, double of what your frame rate is. Shooting in 24 frames per second, we're gonna want a shutter speed of 1/50. That means in 1/50th of a second, that picture is taken of the 24 pictures per second. It's like hummingbird's wings. Now, if you go with a slower shutter speed than what is double your frame rate, you're gonna get motion that looks very, very blurry. If you go higher than double your frame rate with your shutter speed, you're going to get this look that I actually like a lot. In Saving Private Ryan, in the opening scene when they're all battling on the beach, it's creating this sort of anxiety. It can be someone with a knife chasing you in the woods. You all of a sudden are gonna make your audience feel a little bit more uneasy. Now, if you're shooting for slow-mo, this is where it varies. You can do, 125, which is double of 60 frames per second, and that's gonna give you something great. If you want your slow-mo to be even crisper, then you're gonna wanna up that shutter speed a little bit, maybe to 250, 1/250. Now we're gonna go into aperture, also known as f-stop. Actually does two things. It's going to tell the camera how much light you're letting in or not. The other thing it does is it also decides how shallow the depth of field of your focus is going to be. If you have an f-stop of 1 to 1.8, the blades are gonna be almost all the way open, letting a lot of light in, but you're gonna get a very shallow depth of field. For instance, if you are doing a close-up on somebody's face and you have a 1.8 aperture and they turn their face to the side, you might lose focus in that eye away from camera. We go for those higher numbered f-stops. You're doing a very wide exterior shot where you generally want most of the things in focus. I know this is confusing, but because the number goes higher doesn't mean it's a larger number, it actually means it's a smaller number. It really just has to do with the measurements of how closed the blades are or how open they are inside the lens. The next thing you're gonna wanna go to is the ISO. The f-stop and ISO often get mixed up. The f-stop is telling the camera through the lens how much light it's going to let in. The ISO is inside of the camera telling each pixel how to read the light. If you have a really dark room and you just bump that ISO as high as you can, you're gonna see a lot of grain. You're gonna see a lot of static because those pixels are trying to read light, which is not there. That's why we tend to save ISO for near the end. If you're shooting outside on a bright sunny day, you're generally gonna wanna go with about 100 to 200. If you're shooting at night, you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a wide open aperture. The key here is to just use more light. I can probably get to 1600 ISO. That's when I start to see a lot of grain. The next thing I wanna get into is color temperature. You ever shot a video and you're like, why is everything so yellow? Yeah, we've all been there. If you're shooting outside in the middle of the day. 5600 Kelvin is the typical daylight color temperature. And then these tungstens, yellow and orange, really old school lighting, or often those incandescent lights in your house, like from a lamp, you're gonna wanna stick with a color temperature between 4500 and 3200 Kelvin. If you're shooting in the shade, or cloudy, rainy days when everything just looks gray and blue, you're gonna wanna go with a higher color temperature than 5600. You're gonna wanna bring that life back in it. The last thing I wanna go over is picture profile. When you first turn on your camera, you might notice that it's in a standard picture profile. And if you go to those settings, you'll notice that your camera likes to pre-edit the images. Don't use the standard, don't use any other preset picture profile that they have, unless you're okay with just taking it straight out of the camera and using it exactly like that. I think it's good practice, especially if you're a beginner or amateur, to go to the neutral picture profile, where your camera does not edit any of the saturation, the sharpness. You're then going to get images that you have full control over. You can even edit that on your phone.
Been like that for a minute.
If you want your videos to immediately look stunning, buy the 50mm f1.8 fixed prime lens. And you can get this with any camera, it doesn't need to be any specific brand. There's off-brand ones like Rokinon, Canon sells them. Used to be called Nifty 50s because they used to be $50 way back in the day. Nowadays they're 100, 125 depending on where you go, and that is going to be the best purchase of your life for your camera. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.